Okay, looks like 9:15 to me, so we could go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us. Welcome to the second session of the second day. My name is Jason Wright. I will be your moderator and your presenter for this session, so we'll see how that goes. But again, thank you for joining us again. Just a quick reminder on as we go through, feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat or any other issues that you're having. If you're having technical issues, Liz will be happy to help you as best she can. If there's any questions, I will try to get to them as soon as I notice them in the chat. But we're going to be talking today a little bit about some typical BMP operation and maintenance. So as Liz said in the end of the previous session, this is intended to just be a kind of maintenance 101. We're just going to talk about some higher level concepts and then talk a little bit about the schedule. So we'll start with some of those common O&M requirements, and then I have just a little bit on some practices and approaches that can help with some of the asset management. So they're talking about some of the asset management in one of the other sessions. So I want to try to tie the maintenance back into some of the asset management approaches. So we'll talk about that as well. But wanted to start by just saying that the Pennsylvania MS4 permit does require or permittees to ensure that they're providing adequate operation and maintenance for any post-construction stormwater BMP installed at development sites that disturb greater than 1 acre. So there is an element of maintenance required in the permit. Also requires that you develop an inventory of those BMPs and keep that updated. So I'm sure that's what they're talking about, some in the asset management and mapping sessions as well, to make sure that they're included and that you keep that inventory. And the inventory also must include the maintenance that's required and some other information, such as the BMP type, some of the activities, potentially the schedules, and any assessment by the permittee for proper O&M. Do you have a process in place for ensuring that those BMPs are properly maintained? And then there are a number of resources out there. So Liz had a link to them before, and so we can refer you to those manuals as well for determining the O&M requirements. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the slides here are intended to be just examples of typical operation and maintenance procedures for a suite of BMPs. And so we'll jump into that. So we'll start again with O&M requirements. So like I was saying, it's definitely at a little bit bird's eye view here. So we're going to start at that watershed level. So the easiest way to maintain a BMP, to keep it essentially clean and functioning, is to keep the watershed clean, the area that's draining to that BMP. If the water that's going into the BMP is mostly at least free from sediment, oil and grease and trash, then your BMP will be easier to maintain. So that's step one. Keep your watershed clean as much as you can. And so I know we talked before about some illicit discharge detection elimination type processes. So if you have a strong IDDE program, you also may have cleaner BMPs as a result. We'll be keeping trash out of those BMPs. I know a lot of the permits sections do have some elements of street sweeping, so there's a lot of that. We saw some of that yesterday in one of the sessions with the communities that keep in the street sweepers and clean out their inlets on a regular basis. So some of this maintenance, just some of the general good housekeeping, also has an impact on maintaining BMP. So if you're sweeping fairly often, if the street or the area that's draining to the BMP, if you're cleaning that sediment and keeping those areas clean, then your BMPs will function for longer terms and require a little less maintenance. So same thing for trash and litter. If we're keeping the litter out of the watershed, if we're collecting that through trash screens or other processes, then it's also going to extend the life of your BMP and ultimately impact the amount of maintenance that's required. So also in keeping that watershed stabilized. So sediment is the enemy of any BMP. That's one of the biggest issues that we see. The most time we spend the most on is cleaning out the sediment out of the forebays or cleaning sediment out of the bioretention areas or any of the other practices out of our wet ponds. I know we do spend some time eventually dredging wet ponds. And so if we can keep the sediment out of those BMPs, then we won't have to do that quite as often. And so that means keeping good ground cover, keeping the vegetation so that the area around the BMPs is draining to the BMPs is stabilized, and keeping that good mulch cover so that the sediment is not washing off into and clogging our BMPs. So that's the first step of the for the overview that maintains the BMP without even touching the BMP. And so when we really dig into the maintenance, I think the BMP maintenance falls into three main categories. And so it's aesthetics, function, and safety. So a lot of the BMPs that we're implementing now, particularly green stormwater infrastructure, if the BMP it looks nice, if it looks like it's functioning, then it probably is. And so that means pruning, and we'll get into that a little bit more. I think the main functions for maintenance for BMPs are often related to aesthetics. And then we get into that function. There may be a little extra that we need to do to the BMP to make sure it's functioning hydraulically and we're getting the water quality improvements that we're looking for. And then that last element is safety. Of course, we want the public to be safe, particularly with green stormwater infrastructure. We're putting these BMPs out front now. Instead of having the pond behind the building, we're shifting now more to having the BMPs integrated into the landscaping or within the street right of way, which means that the public is now interfacing or interacting directly with that BMP. So safety is definitely an element and there's a maintenance component to that as well. And so we'll walk through that. But again, the aesthetics generally, if you're pruning that vegetation, if you're keeping the mulch refreshed, you're keeping the trash out of the BMP, you're pulling the sediment out of the forebays or those inlets whenever that's necessary, then your BMP is probably functioning. And so we'll talk about a few of these. I think these are some of the more common, the BMPs that I've seen implemented. And so again, just maintaining that landscaping is the good step. If you're doing that, then it's probably functioning pretty well as well. And so on the aesthetic side, it's just also going to depend on the setting where those are implemented. If it's in a shopping center where there's a lot of people coming and going, then you're probably already maintaining that BMP to a high aesthetic. And so I think that's also part of integrating these BMPs, where a lot of the maintenance that's required to keep these BMP functioning, we're already doing these on our landscape. So if it was a landscaped area, again, like the entrance to a shopping center or in the landscape islands around in a parking lot, if we already have vegetation integrated in those, and then we also integrate stormwater management, that's probably maintenance that was already being performed, particularly for that landscaping, if we're trying to maintain that higher level of maintenance. And so pruning does become a large element of maintenance. And so there's some element here with the plants absorbing the pollutants and pruning those and carrying off the material that we're pruning also has some impact on the function. We want to keep these plants healthy and growing, and it has a large impact on the water quality benefits. But again, the maintenance often comes down to that aesthetics and some of the safety. So for pruning, it's all three. If we're keeping these systems looking healthy, then they probably are also functioning. We need that sunlight to get into the bed there to help maintain the pathogens and kill the pathogens there. But then it's also safety. So you got to keep an eye out. So you never know who might be lurking in your bioretention area. And so we gotta make sure we're maintaining these for safety again with the public. So that's me. I guess you can't. It's the part of what we lose in not being in person. You can't see my face as well, but that's me hiding in the bushes. No harm was done to any plants or any pedestrians in the staging of that photo. So that's a big one. Again, if you have a BMP that's grass, so we've seen several BMPs in previous presentations that are grass. Our detention basins, bioretention areas are often turf, and they function quite well for water quality and hydraulic standpoints. And so you're just going to continue mowing these just like you would have if you're integrating a detention in a park somewhere. The maintenance for that is to continue mowing, and so whenever it's needed. So that's again, it's an aesthetic issue first of all, but it also goes towards helping to maintain the function of that BMP. So if we're doing that, it's also important. We've also had several sessions on education, so it's also important the crews who are maintaining these BMPs understand what is a weed or what needs to be mowed versus what the intended aesthetic that we're looking for there. So some of that education becomes important, and making sure our crews know where to mow, where not to mow, and what's supposed to be there, what's not supposed to be there. So I think some of the reference manuals that Liz mentioned in the presentation earlier go through some of that vegetation, helping to understand. But that's where having that planting plan is also pretty important. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. Maintaining that healthy bed of mulch, that's another piece that seems like it's an aesthetic issue, but it definitely ties back to the function. The mulch helps to absorb some of the pollutants, and then it also keeps some of the moisture there, which keeps the rest of the vegetation healthy, which is a key point in maintaining the function for water quality, to remove those pollutants. So it's important to have that healthy bed of mulch, but also keeps the area looking nice. And so most designs require 2 to 3 inches of mulch initially, using a finely shredded hardwood mulch. Those finely shredded mulches tend to float a little less than others. Pine, particularly anything bark or pine, is going to float, and that's going to cause some problems. But so making sure we're using the right materials there, but also keeping that bed 2 to 3 inches in depth. And so generally it's just going to be that restorative maintenance, just like you would a typical landscaping bed, just adding that layer to make sure we're keeping the depth. But every once in a while, every maybe 3 or 4 years or so, depending on your watershed, you may have to go in and take some of that mulch out and put in fresh mulch. But again, I think not uncommon to typical landscape maintenance. We do aim to put in those native vegetations so that we keep maintenance to a minimum. So hopefully once the vegetation is established, you will not have to keep watering it, but you most likely will initially if you have vegetation integrated into your BMP. You may have to irrigate that at least to get establishment, and that's usually a year or two to make sure that vegetation is fully established. But then you may also have to water it periodically during a drought. But again, not that uncommon from typical landscape maintenance. Street sweeping is another common element for maintenance. So it's something we may be doing every 6 months or so, depending on, again, on your watershed or an area and how dirty that is. But that's typically the recommendation, every 6 months to a year. If you have, depending on your BMP, again, particularly for permeable pavement, may need to sweep those about every 6 months. So in my experience, that's also pretty well in line with the maintenance that's being done for streets. So a lot of municipalities are sweeping their streets every few weeks as part of their permit. So if you have permeable pavement in a right of way, then that integrating it into your typical street sweeping routines, it shouldn't have to change those routines to maintain that permeable pavement. If you have a parking lot, some parking lot owners sweep their parking lots and some do not, but it still generally fits in with the typical maintenance for that. And so we'll talk a little bit about the different street sweepers and their effectiveness here in a minute. Do need to talk to our landscapers again about mowing. So it's a little bit of specialized mowing. We don't want to be scalping these areas, so we don't want the areas directly surrounding the BMP to be a sediment source that might clog those areas. And so we definitely need to have that education and some of those conversations with the landscapes crews, but we need to be careful not to scalp these. So generally we want that turf and grass around the BMPs to be 3 to 6 inches depending on the BMP. You may have to redistribute some mulch occasionally. So this is where we get into some of those not necessarily routine. This is maybe something that you have to do a little bit less frequently, but after some of the larger rain events, you may have to redistribute some of that mulch. This is where hopefully using that finely shredded hardwood mulch helps reduce the amount of times that we have to. That mulch typically locks a little bit better, creates more of a mat, and stays put a little bit better than bark or pine chips. But also something else to be thinking about. We may have to maintain some of that vegetation. We generally do try to keep out the invasives, and there can be some specialized maintenance for that. So there is a protocols for removing cattails from wetlands that I think you can find in some of those other guidance manuals. But we do want to try to keep those out, depending on the type of BMP as well. Wetlands, we tend to try to keep trees from establishing, or I've seen a lot of photos of sand filters that look a lot more like bioretention areas. So depending on the type of BMP, may need to have some occasional maintenance there to keep out those invasive species, and definitely to keep out the cattails and some of the trees and shrubs, depending on the type of BMP and where it's located. Most of the guidance I've seen has recommended to clean out the forebay when it's 50% full. I've seen a few that say 25% full, but that will depend on your local regulations and some of the guidance that Liz mentioned today as well. But again, this is a little bit specialized maintenance that hopefully you won't have to do too often, maybe every few years or so, or up to 5 years, depending on the watershed. But if hopefully your BMP has been designed with this in mind, with some type of forebay or pre-treatment at the inlet. So pre-treatment is really important. And so this comes back to there's some design elements in this, and that's a whole nother workshop for a whole different day. But there are a lot of practices that you can consider and include in the design of these systems of any type of BMP that will help reduce the amount of maintenance that is required. And pre-treatment is right at the top of that list. We definitely want to make sure when we're designing and implementing these BMPs that we have really good pre-treatment. And so that at least helps us to focus the maintenance instead of having to clean sediment or dredge a pond every few years or even every year, depending on the watershed. We can really focus that maintenance on the forebay. So it's important to include those elements in the design. Some other specific or specialized maintenance for if you have a soil media. So this could apply to bioretention areas or to sand filters, or really any type of infiltration practice, even if it's a extended detention basin or an infiltration basin. We may have to go in and clean out that media every once in a while as well. So if we have a lot of fine sediments in our watersheds, it may have to happen a little bit more often than every few years. But this is something generally we're seeing every 4 to 6 years or so. We may have to go in and scoop off some of that sediment. And so that means we're scooping off that top 3 inches of media, which also means we're removing the mulch if there's mulch there, and bringing back a fresh media to restore that infiltration. And so I have some simple metrics, some simple tests that we can do that we'll talk about in just a minute. So I see we have a question here, and we'll try to answer that real quick. So how about river rock instead of mulch in areas that might have swiftly moving stormwater? I think rock can be a place for mulch. So I've also seen it in areas that have a lot of intense sunlight, or that's generally something we see more out in the arid southwest areas where mulch tends to degrade pretty quickly. But rock can be a substitute. So if your water's, it's generally about an inch or a foot per second. If your velocity of your flow is more than a foot per second, you're going to need something more solid than mulch. So turf grass or bringing in sod can also be a good alternative. That tends to hold up for much higher flows. We generally get more 3 feet per second with seed. It can go higher than that if we're using turf mats. I think turf matting, you can go up even to about 10 feet per second on the velocity coming through there. So those are good alternatives. But river rock can definitely work. But you do lose a little bit of that function of the mulch. So the mulch helps retain that moisture for the vegetation, and also can absorb some types of pollutants. And so river rock can be an acceptable alternative, but you do lose a little bit of that water quality or pollutant removal function. All right, so here's some general maintenance tasks. So sediment prevention is generally going to be as needed. I know that's a little bit ambiguous, but again, that's one that's really going to depend on your watershed. If you have a lot of erosion in your watershed, then you may need to have to remove sediment from your forebay or your pretreatment areas after every larger event. But hopefully, if you have good pretreatment, you can go a little bit longer. I think you could go even 6 months to a year on removing sediment from some of the pretreatment. And then if it's something like a wet pond, you may be able to go even 10 to 15 years without having to dredge those wet ponds. But those are things that we do need to keep inspecting, keep an eye on those types of things. Trash removal, again, is really an aesthetic consideration. And so it can clog inlets, but generally it's not going to have that much of an effect on the function of the BMP unless again you have a smaller inlet and it's clogged with trash. But generally we're saying monthly to semi-annually for trash removal, depending on the aesthetic that you're looking for. Again, if it's in a area where there's a lot of public interaction there, you might want to, that might need to be done more frequently. Mowing, again, it's as needed depending on the quality of the grass, but we're usually looking to that 3 to 4, even to 6 inches if it's in a swale, to really get the good water quality. Pruning, again, is an aesthetic issue that we're looking for. Removing sediment, again, we talked about that. Mulch renewal could be annually, again, depending on the aesthetic that you're looking for. And that's mulch renewal. So that's just adding some new mulch. Mulch removal or replacement, we're seeing generally more like every 3 years or less frequently, depending again on the watershed and your pretreatment. And then your plant replacement. So it depends on the design of the BMP. So we certainly want our vegetation to look nice, but unless the vegetation is dead, it still may have some function. And so I know I said we want to remove cattails from wetlands, but that's another example. The cattails do provide some function, but they've been known to attract mosquitoes. So if you're in an area around the public, somewhere in a park, something like that, then you probably want to remove the cattails. If it's more of a transportation, we talked about PennDOT. I'm pretty sure they have some wetland swales around some of their highways. Then if people aren't going to be around it, then maybe the cattails isn't as big of an issue. So again, some specific maintenance for some of these types of BMPs. So for permeable pavement, we're trying to prevent the clogging. We're going to pull some weeds and grass, may need to treat some for the oil and grease. And so this is another design element, thinking about where we're putting these BMPs. So you can see, if you were in the previous session, I love an oak tree. I've got a lot of them in my backyard now, but they can be rough on the permeable pavement. So anything that drops leaves or acorns can get crushed into that sediment. So this is a photo I borrowed from Bill Hunt at NC State. So you can see the leaves and the acorns there that have been crushed into the permeable pavement. So those are things to look for. So again, hopefully we're keeping our parking lots clean, and we're blowing the leaves off of the parking lots pretty frequently, and this won't be an issue, but it is something to keep an eye out, or keep an eye on at least. So sweeping, again, there's lots of different types of street sweepers. So big to small. I think the one on the bottom right is I think that's in Texas. So as expected, it's a very large street sweeper, but depending on the level of maintenance. So generally what we found is that the mechanical sweepers and regenerative air sweepers work well for routine maintenance. So if you're sweeping if you have something in a right of way and you're sweeping your streets every couple of weeks, then something like a mechanical or regenerative air should function well to maintain that BMP if you're doing it pretty regularly. Regenerative air is a little better, so that does help pick up a little bit more of the sediment. So if you're doing that even monthly or so, then you're great. But even the typical maintenance for permeable pavement is every 6 months to a year. So if you're using a regenerative air every 6 months to a year, that should suffice to keep that permeable pavement functioning. But if you've gone for years without sweeping your permeable pavement and looks like it's clogged, then that's where you may need a little bit more powerful sweeper. And so that would be something like a vacuum powered street sweeper. And so I've definitely seen some where we thought that permeable pavement was clogged and we were never going to get it back. So we weren't down to zero, but we were pretty darn close. We really weren't sure we were going to be able to restore it. And we ran a vacuum powered street sweeper over it. It took 4 or 5 passes, but we were eventually able to restore that infiltration rates back to over 100 inches per hour. And so, depending on who you talk to, some of these pavers are capable of 1,000 inches per hour infiltration. And so, if you can get it back to 100, that's still pretty good. So, but that's generally the recommendation. Mechanical regenerative air are fine for routine maintenance. If you need restorative maintenance, then we're going to go to that vacuum powered street sweeper. And so I think we saw one of the groups yesterday, if you were there for some of the SOPs, they have the Elgin Whirlwind. And so again, not an endorsement of any type of product by me or anyone else who's a part of this workshop, but that's what we've seen. The Elgin Whirlwind does work really well to restore these, but there are lots of vacuum powered street sweepers on the market that you can use. And so if you hopefully you have one of these in your fleet that you can be using to help restore and maintain some of the permeable pavement. Grass growth can be an issue in permeable pavement. That's a sign of sediment accumulation, but we recommend not pulling those because the weeds and the roots, if they get down deep enough, can disturb the subgrade of the permeable pavement. And so this becomes my most favorite maintenance approach. We actually recommend that you burn them. So we used to talk about things like Roundup and other types of pesticides, but it really seemed wrong to recommend using a pesticide or an herbicide on a BMP that's meant to improve water quality. So I took all of that out of my presentation, and now the main recommendation is to burn those weeds to get rid of them, which I will gladly do for anyone who needs it. And so again, there's just a little bit more specific on the permeable pavement. Again, we talked about regular sweeping and vacuuming. Want to make sure we're replacing that gravel if you need to. So if you have pavers that have a bedding material with gravel, you may need to replace those after you vacuum them. But it should be okay for mechanical and regenerative air sweepers. Keeping that landscape debris. So this is another construction or maintenance practice. Try to keep people from using your permeable pavement as staging areas. And if you're if we're using salt or sand for these, that can also be a little bit of an issue. And so I think it's okay for routine maintenance. If you're using sand, just to come back in and sweep them off should be fine. But just try to avoid putting piling up large amounts of snow on the permeable pavement or using them as staging areas for your sand or your salt treatments. Yep. So it's really helpful, I think, when you're maintaining these to have some O&M plans. And so it's good if the crews who you're sending out understand what they're working on and what they're maintaining. And so I'm sure there's some of these examples in some of the manuals that Liz mentioned today as well, but it's good to have the checklists when you're sending the crews out. So it helps them to evaluate the BMP performance. And so it's good to know what you're maintaining. So there's several options for that. So it's an example of what I would call a facility field card. So it gives a lot of information on the types of BMPs that are there. And so this might be helpful for someone on the crew to have some of that information. So particularly if you're maintaining a forebay or a wet pond, understanding what those elevations and depths should be is really helpful for maintenance. Maintenance checklists are also helpful. So this is a good one that talks about tasks, talks about the frequency, and then but this one also includes an indicator for when that maintenance is needed. So if you have excess sediment built up in your bioretention area, then you're going to need some maintenance. If you have a lot of vegetation that's dead or not looking so good, then that's time to perform some maintenance there. So these are good. It's a place for notes. And I really like these types of approaches. And so I think these are really helpful for maintenance crews for standing water. But I think it's also helpful to engage other professionals that are around. So I think, the maintenance crews are going to be coming out to do the maintenance, but anyone can do the inspection. So if you have crews that are spending time out in the field a lot, so if you have someone that drives your street sweeper and is passing BMPs regularly, they can help do those inspections while they're in the field. If they notice that there's some sediment building up in the bioretention area adjacent to the street that they're sweeping, they could log that, and then you can start tracking those and know where to come focus your maintenance. So, but that's where I think these types of checklists are helpful. So it seems pretty simple, but I think it's good to see when an indicators of when those conditions of maintenance might be needed, and then the results that we're expecting to see when you perform that maintenance. So if you have standing water in your bioretention area, probably means you've got some sediment built up in accumulation. Once you remove that, then we expect that standing water to infiltrate generally in 24 to 48 hours. But that's a design element. So there's plants. Obviously, having a planting plan is helpful. Knowing which plants should be there and what shouldn't. So that's another design issue, but something that can help is making sure we're clumping that vegetation. So you can see we have them in groups. When you scatter the vegetation out through the bioretention area, it's really tough on maintenance crews to know what should be there and should not. But if you have them grouped, then it's a little bit easier to tell which one of these things is not like the other. So it does help the maintenance professionals a little bit. So always questions on cost. There's a little bit of that. WRF has a good life cycle cost model. Um, this is one in Denver I like to reference, but then I'm sure the Finance Center that we've heard from some of them have some costs for maintenance as well. And then I know the manuals that are being developed for PennDOT, I believe, will also have costs as well. So I want to take one more minute. We're running a little low here, but just to talk about rapid assessments. And so I talked about some maintenance triggers. And so I really like a good simple test. And so these are a few that you can perform. And so there's some rapid assessments for infiltration. So this is one, this is in some of the municipal recommendations. So I know it looks like a gas can, but it's actually a infiltration testing device. So I was going to say highly calibrated, but that's probably not true. It's somewhat calibrated. So you see there's an orifice there on that gas can. So you generally know the rate that you're pouring the water in, and you can measure the circumference of that circle. And there's a formula where you can figure out generally what the infiltration rate is. So not something you're going to get published in a peer-reviewed journal article, but if you're just looking to see if your permeable pavement's functioning pretty well, this is a good test. And so as long as you can see that circle's pretty small, I think the infiltration rate there was calculated to be about 100 inches per hour, something like that. So if you're in that 100 inch per hour range on this test, then you're probably doing pretty well. You could definitely get more sophisticated on that on the full double ring infiltrometer test. But I like the one on the right is the Turp Tech infiltrometers. Those are pretty easy to use. Just essentially fill that up with water and time it. So can be a pretty quick test. If you really want to get into a little bit more in depth in your asset management, so we talked about logging some of the performance of these BMPs and the maintenance. There are some pretty cheap tools that you can use, monitoring equipments. The one on the bottom left's a pressure transducer. I think those are about $50. The one on the top right is a soil moisture probe, which I think is also $25 to $50 for some of these probes that you can put in to collect that data. So I know the last thing that we want is to have more data to have to process and evaluate, but there are a lot of tools out there that you can use to pretty rapidly collect data that can go a long way to help making informed decisions on when and where to target your maintenance. So those are just a couple. So with that, we'll take some questions. So I know we've had one. So I think, again, if you want to put that in the chat, we can get to that. But I think at this point, again, if you want to just raise that hand so we don't all talk at once. And I'm happy to take any questions. Okay. Apparently I lulled you all and bored you all to sleep. There's no questions on maintenance of BMPs. Okay. Thank you, Brian. Okay. So is Jamie, are you in the session? I know there was some discussion about a maintenance manual that's being developed. So I think there's going to be quite a few resources and references available to the area. So I know Villanova University, Robert Traver there, and Bridget Wasduk, I think, have published some information on maintenance. So I know it's a few states over, but I know that several professors at the University of Minnesota offer trainings. They have some really great references and resources for BMPs in general, but also specific to maintenance. Okay, I'm happy to hang out for a little bit longer, but let's see. Okay, have you heard much from maintenance crews about problems with water getting under the road when using permeable gutters or pavement? Um, I have not, but that's because I always make sure my BMP, anything I put next to the road, has a liner, and so um, I know it can be an issue. I haven't really heard much of anyone that directly blames issues with the roads on that, but I've had the same conversations and convincing transportation engineers that putting a bioretention area next to a road isn't going to cause the road to be swallowed up in a giant seep hole. Those are interesting conversations. And so if you look at some of the standard details that are out there, particularly, Philadelphia obviously has extensive standard details, and a lot of other communities do as well. Generally, I'm gonna put some kind of liner on the between the road. And the discussions I've had, generally, if you put a liner down about 3 feet, that should prevent any lateral movement of water to a depth that would impact the subgrade. So if we have some the soils are wetted 3 feet below the subgrade, then it shouldn't impact the road. And so that's generally what you'll see. Anything I design, I make sure there's some either a 30 mil PVC, or a lot of the things we're putting in the transportation corridors are concrete as well. But there's some type of barrier there, at least 3 feet below the surface, to prevent the lateral seepage from impacting the roadway. So that's seems to take care of any concerns for that. But that would be my recommendation. So we definitely don't want any of that lateral seepage.
In just a second.
Okay, so I think we've got four more minutes for questions before we go back to the larger group. Catherine, did that answer your question? Okay. Well, again, thank you all for joining, being part of our forum. Okay. Do BMPs have a lifespan? Yes, and it depends. So that's our usual engineering answer, right? Is it depends. So I've generally, when we're doing life cycle costs for BMPs, we're going to assume that some significant element of the BMP is going to need to be replaced in 20 to 25 years. So for a bioretention area, that means if you're putting it in next to a road and it's lined in concrete, probably aren't going to have to replace the concrete. I think we generally assume that you're going to have to replace everything down to the underdrain. So underdrains are usually PVC that should hold up longer, but everything down to the gravel, to the media, the vegetation, some of the inlet energy dissipations, all that's going to have to be replaced in 25 years, 20 to 25 years. But then there's a lot we can do to keep to keep them functioning. So I know specifically of a permeable pavement site that was put in right as I was um, as I was an extension associate at NC State. It was put in 2005, and so it has been maintained. They've been sweeping it fairly regularly, at least once a year, and it's still functioning. And so I know there's permeable pavement sites in Florida and other areas that have been in for 20 to 30 years and are still holding up structurally, but that are regularly maintained. And so I think that's the key. If we're maintaining these BMPs, and every BMP needs some type of maintenance, it could be 20 to 30 years before we have to replace significant elements of the BMPs. As long as we're doing the mulch renewal occasionally, you may have to scrape off that top layer of sediment like we talked about, maybe in 5 years or so, depending on your watershed. But that's what we use for our life cycle costs is 20 to 25 years. So yeah, there's a maintenance professional early in my career I worked with in Wilmington, who basically his approach to maintenance was pay me now or pay me later. And we try to emphasize that, and we do some education with homeowners associations and those kind of groups. If you could pay $400 or $500 a year or $1,000 a year, depending on the BMP, to keep it functioning. Or if you don't do anything for 10 years, you might have to pay $20,000 to get that pond or BMP back to functioning. And so we've obviously really stressed the importance of that maintenance and keeping track of that maintenance and the log on what BMPs are requiring more frequent maintenance.